So the last brief video, well, the last one wasn't that brief, but this one's going to be really brief, is on the Truman Show. So interestingly, 1998, a year before The Matrix or Existence, we have the Truman Show, a Jim Carrey dramatic comedy about somebody who is born in a completely simulated environment. And so there's a couple of takeaways, I think, from that film that are sort of noteworthy. The first one is the idea that as it is revealed in the opening scene by the creator, director, Christoph, is that even though the world he lives in is fake or is simulated, let's use that term, nothing is fake about Truman. He's genuine, it's a life. So, of course, the name Truman is a compound word of true and man, is the only man that is true in that entirely untruthful or simulated environment. And interestingly, right, there are in the opening credits all these interviews about the actors, and notably the person who plays his wife says that, well, there's no difference between the private and the public. The Truman Show is my life, and it is a lifestyle. And Marlon, his friend, points out that nothing is fake, everything is controlled. And it's the idea, metaphorically, that society itself is controlled. I think in a way that speaks to us more directly, controlled through a set of written and unwritten rules by which we abide by to be able to live in society. So, what is interesting is that people tune in on Truman for comfort. In other words, their lives may be dominated by fakeness in their interactions with others, and we have to put this mask in society to be able to interact. We have to interact politely, not necessarily how we feel towards others, but how we're supposed to behave towards others. And because Truman's interactions are genuine, the true expression of himself, they find comfort in that. One could also see in the configuration of the Truman Show an instantiation of the experimental novel. And as I explained, experimental novel looked at literature as a way in which to understand and predict human behavior in controlled environments. And that's exactly what Truman is. He's a human sample in a controlled environment, and depending on how we control the environment around him, then Truman will act and react. For example, most notably, the death of his father, which gave him aquaphobia, and the way in which we instill fear in Truman so that he doesn't take particular courses of action so as to leave the island and try to find out what's beyond the confines of his perfect little, town. There are, of course, the predominance of consumerism in the show. The show is entirely financed by product placements. I think that's a nice sort of reference to consumerism and the ways in which consumer capitalism is linked to the hyperreal and to linked to simulation, as well as Baudrillard explains. I also think it's interesting to hear Christoph say that Truman arrived on cue. In other words, he was selected because the show was supposed to go online on a particular date, and he was born on that date. And he also points out that he's the first human being adopted by a corporation. So that speaks a lot of our current lives, how our current lives and current existence are dominated by corporations. And I remember well a couple of years ago when Barack Obama was president, he had somewhat of a Freudian slip, and a Freudian slip is when you say what you're really thinking, but you should not say it. And he's called the United States of America the United Corporations of America. So I think that speaks very much to our present state in the ways in which corporations, even our own lives, our own whole healthcare, is dominated by corporations. And one could argue that this democratic government that we, representative democracy that we have, is also dominated by corporations through lobbying. The ways in which the gun lobby or the pharmaceutical lobby, I wouldn't say directly buy, but influence politicians through donations to their campaigns to, of course, advocate their corporate their corporations' causes. I'm sorry. A couple of other interesting lines from Christoph, of course, say that Truman accepts the reality is presented in the same way that we accept the reality we are presented. And I'm not talking only about media presentations of reality, whether it's the news or social media, whatnot, but also in the ways, in a more essential way, in the ways we perceive reality is the way we accept it. Remember that sort of model of reality, perception, cognition, that operates at the same level. And then finally, when Truman is about to leave the show and he's at the wall, at the end of the world, so to speak, and about to leave, Christoph tries to convince him to stay because he created an environment where he was completely safe. That even though the world around him, he was real, and his life, he needs to consider his life to be real and not a fake one. And Christoph reveals at that moment also that he created a perfect world, a world as it should be, rather than a world as it is. But interestingly, of course, Truman chooses to leave because, similar to Ex Machina, it seems that freedom is very essential to defining our own sense of place, our own sense of self, and our own sense of humanity. This idea that freedom is at the center of both Ex Machina and Truman Show may, as an aside, also speak ideologically to the ways in which in the US we discuss freedom, or what we think freedom is. And freedom may seem to be to our ability to move freely as we wish. But of course, there's all these undercurrents regarding fear of the other, or fear of life itself. Who are we to determine our own existence if we were to give an absolute freedom to our comings and goings? And of course, I think that as an aside, this idea of freedom of movement speaks particularly well at this current moment where we are confined in our own homes and where politicians think that, creating these drastic measures like in Italy or the rest of Europe of lockdowns can't work in the US because we have such this dogged idea about what it means to be free, or what it means to be an American, and what freedom plays in our identity as Americans as well. So anyways, if you have any questions about the lecture, about any of the screenings, post them in the lecture notes and discussion board. Remember that you must post a response to one screening at least. Any additional postings that you put on discussion board counts for additional credit as well.